presentation in astronomical science going all the way to quantum mechanics. Today we're going to consolidate the discoveries that we've made together, both in Boschkovichian force mechanics and in a new geometry which I discovered in 2022, which is spherical geometry, quite plain and simple. Due to the recent discoveries that I just named, those two discoveries have enabled a solution to two of the most outstanding problems in physics, which can be conceived as the two basic problems of astrophysics in a spherical dimension in which we find ourselves, since we on Earth are on a spherical surface, and the universe appears uniform spherically in all directions. So the solution is spherical going out. Also, in the 20th century, it was discovered that the center of the universe, and this is the right way to say it now, we know, the center of the universe is also spherical. The center of the universe is the proton. That can be proved, and so we'll begin there. Going from the center to the edge is logical. The proton is the only particle that is now known, although the word particle needs to be defined very carefully, and in fact, the way to carefully define what is a particle is by realizing that the proton is in fact that particle. Any other use of the word particle would be an extended use of that word. So the first word that we need to understand in physics is the word particle. This goes all the way back to the Greeks, as you're well acquainted with. I trust that you already know that. If you're interested, you could also research that. I believe the man's name is Democritus, who, according to the history of science composed by later men, that was the best definition of the atom, was the Democritus definition of the atom. The search for the atom went on through the late 19th century. The electron had been discovered, but it wasn't until the 20th century that the proton was discovered. In fact, in the spherical geometry of the Bohr-Rutherford atom, as it had been come to be called, and now has been recomputed according to quantum mechanical constructs, which are purely mathematical. We'll be getting into that as well to discover the mathematical formulation of what is now considered to be the atom, but that is invalid and unhelpful, except in technology, which is now the current definition of science, which changed by a process of human evolution. But science is no longer conceived to be directed towards wisdom, which had been its historical and in fact its divine prerogative. And so all hope for mankind is gone in its use of science. The original use of science, which is essentially the employment of rational logic to discern the physical universe and to understand it, that is no longer sought anywhere. And science has been redefined according to its industrial aspect, which now dominates humanity. So it's a bit confusing, I think, and I'd like to disambiguate the definition of science. Certainly the way I use it is correct, but even the very definition of science now, in what is called science, is no longer valid. It's obvious that out on YouTube we're getting a projection of what science actually is for humans. A social media platform would be a reasonable place, I would think, to discern where science is going for humanity. But those of us who have read the journals and read the articles and read the books and attended the lectures and perhaps even done our own research, all of us at the actual cutting edge of science, doing real science in a responsible way, there is a consensus now all around the world, according to my very, very limited research, and basically this would have to be an intuition. It's sort of philosophical, but it's very important at the outset of this lecture or any other lecture on real science, is that it's no longer acceptable. Wisdom is no longer acceptable to common humans, and the direction of science is completely off course. The current accepted definition of what science does for humanity is now directed away from Earth, which is considered to be a death trap. Even rats know when they're trapped, and they will escape a sinking ship because they know that their doom is coming soon. Humans have no such escape from the maze that they're in, and so false prophets such as Elon Musk dominate the scene. These are pseudoscientists, of course, but they're attempting to survive. That is the prime directive according to natural selection evolution, which is taught to us as children, and still is. A disproved theory that shows that our only purpose is to survive long enough to procreate, to make more humans. That leads to a forward recursion, which a rational man is required to solve in his role as a scientist, or as perhaps should probably be said from now on. The older use of the word science was natural philosophy. Natural philosophy is a form of guided religion in which the answers being sought do not appeal to supernatural or fanciful notions, which are simply that. They have to be characterized that way because they cannot be proved. And so the existence of God is thought to be unprovable, and therefore science has lost all interest in religion, divinity, supernaturality, and of course the solution to the human equation, which balances on oblivion in the form of physical death, which is the loss of consciousness. To answer these basic human concerns from the point of view of modern pseudoscience, which it should be called, Elon Musk is a perfect exponent of the, I would say, instinctive solution. We are obviously blueprinted to reach for the stars. Now that's impossible, and so it's as if water were piling up behind a dam, because we have to reach the stars. We know that we have a connection with the stars that is instinctive to us, and so we do astronomy, and that of course is the divine prerogative of man, is to look up and consider the cosmos. In our discussion today, we'll be probing the entire limits of the universe, but it is important to distinguish between my goal, which is the goal of a rational, wise man, I think is the correct way to say it, although that sounds presumptuous. I have no sense of presumption in me. It's been eliminated from my entire mental and emotional profile. I have very little sense of self-worth, except in context of science, and so my entire identity has become focused on solving the scientific propositions that have faced humanity since the beginning of time. And what you're about to hear is the correct way to get solutions from science, and it is the only way to get it, and I'm the only man that does it. So if you consider that to be perhaps a red flag, that you don't want to listen to someone with my kind of attitude or self-evaluative projection, then you're of course welcome to turn this off. But if you're turning this on This is my game now, and I'll decide what the rules are. So as we get going here, we're going to begin at the proton. But it's important, and now I will begin to ask you to engage yourself, that is your mind, in perhaps a new way. I don't think it would be new for you, but it might be unfamiliar, perhaps unused. A normal human conversation needs to be linear because we're very simple in the way we converse with each other. This is not a conversation, it is a lecture. You can't talk back to me. I wish you could, but that is not going to be possible in the near or foreseeable future. So this is the only way that you're going to get the answers. This is the only way you're going to understand science, is by listening to me. And it's also the only way you're going to get wisdom, which is actually the goal of understanding in a philosophic sense, you could say, since of course nobody can prove that. So we do have a two-sided universe, and I'm asking you now to consider both ends at once, the center and the edge. Okay, that's very important because it's a geometrical approach. We're beginning at the center, but I've already jumped to the edge, and I have also jumped between the scientific approach and human approach. So you see that I've split two subjects into two parts, and we now have four things that we're dealing with. This is called in one context an exfoliation of logic. And it's complex. It's not complicated, it's meant to be simplifying, but it does require you to think. So if you're not capable of thinking, or you're afraid of thinking, or you don't think that I'm being proper in asking you to think for whatever reason, then you can turn this off and leave. But these are the right rules that I have decided upon, and since we have no way to communicate with each other, you're simply listening to me. I'm telling you the way things are going to be. So to summarize all that, so we can now proceed forward on a new tack which I've carefully set up, although it may not seem careful. We are approaching science from a logical point of view. We're also approaching science from a human point of view. These are two separate questions, of course, because the human being is composed of two subsystems. The emotional subsystem, which is dominant and also contains love, and the other, rational onboard system, with which we're already blueprinted, which is the divine means of connectivity with divinity. And if you don't like that, again, and will be the last time I say it, you can turn this off, but this is actually the truth that you have been waiting to hear. All humanity has been waiting to hear what I am about to say. So again, let's go on. We have four parts that we're dealing with. I've already told you two of them. The human and scientific approach, with which we're blueprinted, okay? The other two, aspects of another dichotomy, which is the right word for this. The universe itself, as a physical unit, is a sphere. We'll be extending that concept to the hypersphere by the end of this lecture. But the way we first encounter the universe, scientifically, historically, the way mankind has found himself placed in the universe, is on a spherical surface to a spherical universe. So everything is spherical. From the center of the atom to the edge of the universe, everything is spherical. At mid-scale, what we call macro-scale, the cosmic objects, beginning at Earth, everything is spherical. The Earth is spherical, and even its tiny satellite, which we call the moon, is a sphere. These are perfect spheres. They're oblated due to rotation, and they have corrugated surfaces. In the case of the Earth, a layered surface called the atmosphere, the hydrospheric, the hydro and, I'm searching for the word for air, hydro and strato layers. So they're not perfect spheres in one sense, but they're obviously geometrically perfect spheres. The sun is spherical. It's not solid, it's plasma. but it's spherical. And one must ask why, and I've discovered that science knows it, but is seeking a more technical solution in order to answer a different orientation that modern science has from natural science. So that's the situation that we're dealing with. We as humans, both collectively and individual, have a dual system, and we find ourselves born on a spherical surface into a spherical universe with two essential goals. So a sphere has two edges. It has a center, which is an edge, and the outer edge, which is considered to be the edge in just ordinary words. So those are the technical aspects of what we're doing, and now we begin at the center. The proton is now known to be the center of the universe, and a comment needs to be said there because there is a skewing between the center of the universe and the edge of the universe. The edge of the universe, because it's the integral of the entire universe, is only one surface. It's an unbounded surface, but I've solved that, and we're going to get to that as well. It's not unbounded, but it appears unbounded. And now that we've used the Hubble telescope, space telescope, and the James Webb telescope, which is currently probing further even than the Hubble telescope could probe, it's obvious that the universe is going to continue to appear infinite for the foreseeable future. And so the cosmology, or if you look into it, if you look for other cosmologies other than the dominant one, you will no longer find any. There's only one cosmology, and of course it cannot possibly be right. So we're not going to be dealing with traditional cosmology for the simple reason that traditional cosmology can only be wrong. Until we have a bounded edge, which has never been achieved mathematically, geometrically, or with our instruments, we cannot find an edge and we cannot conceive an edge. I can. So we're going to get to the edge so that we can integrate the universe so that we understand it. That is our goal here. But in order to do so, we also need to understand the center of the universe. This has never been done. It's never taught. And the reason for that is an inability to see the connection between the center and the edge. That is logically obvious, and it's not an indictment. It's just the situation that science has found itself in. Without being able to conceive of the spherical universe as having a center or an edge is an illogicality which shuts down our mental processes. So I'm going to restart your mental processes in terms of true rational logic so that you can actually perceive the universe correctly the way it actually is, without the intervention of interpretations. It simply is the way it is. But in order to do that, we have to confront the paradox that has faced all of science and all scientists and all humans who consider the universe itself. It has no center and it has no edge. The way to solve that is first by realizing that it is a paradox. In my work as a logician, I have learned empirically that paradoxes are paired. And so it's just a curiosity, I suppose, that the word paradox has the word pair in it. They're unrelated etymologically, but as a mnemonic, I find it quite fascinating. You could say we're looking for a pair of doxes. I hope you enjoy that joke, but I'm in no laughing mood. I hope you're happy. I'm happy, but I don't want to show it. So the center to the universe is in each and every proton. That is a wild sounding statement. You're going to have to accept that because in order to solve a paradox, which is already a wild irrationality, one must obtain the anti-paradox. And so this will stretch your mind, and that's good for you. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to think. What you might be afraid of is trust, and that you must always have. is the fear of trusting another human being. Don't trust me or anyone else, but in order to gain the advantages of science through the natural process of communication, which is science, you do have to trust the person that you're listening to. If you prefer not to do that, I encourage you not to do that. You do not need me to understand the universe. If you want the short path, which I can also assure you is the divine path, you need to take up astronomy, which is a very, very difficult and intricate process of arranging your life so that you can get out under the night sky without getting chilly toes or a frozen nose. This is the Christmas season, so I did just make a rhyme, but I do not write Hallmark cards. You do not need humans. You never did. There's another side to that, which has to do with love of puppies, etc. But if you're trying to do science, you're going to need to acquire, if you don't already have it, a certain courage, a certain bravery, a certain determination to get your answers at all costs. And this is simply the nature of wisdom, that it demands the most of you, and you would not want it any other way. So if you want the high road to wisdom and the answers you need for your life, which is what you're seeking, whether you admit it or not, I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to get you to heaven. In whatever sense you conceive that, the answers to your problems in life are right here, right now. So you have two options. You can take up astronomy and devote your life to it. Consolidate your life around the night sky to organize your time and your resources to give you the maximum exposure of your eyeballs to heaven. I've already spoken in the past of what you can do if you're blind. You're in an advantageous situation if you're blind because you've never used your eyes. This would be someone congenitally blind. You can still do the same thing, but with the advantage that you will not be deceived by your physical vision. Now, we don't ordinarily conceive of our physical vision as leading us astray in any way. It doesn't, and you are handicapped if you can't use your eyes. But you don't need them at all to achieve wisdom. So, given the fact that this pertains to all human beings, including children at a very early age can be exposed to the night sky to their tremendous advantage. There's a reason that fathers do not take their sons or daughters under the night sky at an early age, although some tribes in Africa, I have heard, and this aroused some emotion in me, seeing photographs and descriptions of men whose newborn son, in most cultures the son is preferred to a daughter, but disregard that, it's just superstitious. So sons or daughters, you bring them under the night sky and talk to them, even though they can't necessarily understand what you're saying because they don't know how to talk yet or understand human words. The emotion will be felt by that child, which will affect that child forever. And it's extremely important, and of course it's never done in America. It's never done in so-called civilized nations. Only primitive nations or tribes have the connection with nature that permits them to exercise their instinctual desire to reveal to their children the night sky, which is the road to salvation. The events here on earth are crushing and finally ultimately destructive. But the forces of heaven work in the opposite direction to evolve us in the way that our Creator intended us to evolve, which was to see more and more of what He has done. So that is the guiding influence, the spirit under which I work, is to get you to your highest goal, the ultimate goal, which was designed for you. That depends 100% on love, and you'll need to discover the love that was given to you to return to the Creator who gave it to you, and that is the full summation of human religion. So now you know both sides of religion. And now we're going to deal with science. The proton is a distributed object. It is the definition of weight. It is the definition of mass. And it's also the definition, I should say, the definitional basis of why everything in the universe is spherical. It is because of the proton. And we now know that through the extraordinary reach of electrodynamic science has proved that the proton is the center of the electrodynamic system. That is a spherical relationship with the electron system, the combination of which creates the atom, which is a perfect sphere. So the universe is made of tiny spheres. The proton by itself, which is then called an ion, if it has no attached electron, is still a sphere. And so we begin there with an isolated proton to analyze once and for all, to sum up science so that it can be understood at its highest level in this sense. The proton now is known to have a structure. So we're going to begin at the furthest reach that subatomic physics has yet reached, so that you understand where science is at, so that you will know exactly the cumulative result of all of physics. In the subatomic world, the proton is the center. By itself, it is spherical, and it has a radius of approximately 0.8 femtometers. This is very interesting because it implies that the proton is a unit. This has been proved in the cyclotron research that has been going on for decades. You will recognize it under a new name which has been awarded to the cyclotron, formerly so called. They are now called hadron colliders. This will bring us in contact with modern technological physics, which is evil. It is not designed for good in any way, although it has very good influences. Indeed, as the jet age has had enormous benefits, certainly to myself. We very much enjoy turbojets, but turbojets are not primarily the reason for air flight. The reason for air flight is not to benefit humans in the way it is used. The reason for air flight is to get over the heads of enemies to destroy them from the sky. And that's also the reason that we, speaking of nations, collectivities of group minds, or I should say collectivities of men that form group minds, the goal of humanity in the evil sense is to get into outer space in order to get over the heads of all enemies so as to destroy them from outer space. So the Hadron Collider is a genuine evil. It's a work of Satan, you could say, if you're a religious person. We prefer not to talk that way in science. I don't give a fuck what science prefers to say. I will say anything I want if it's true and necessary to understand. And Hadron Colliders are a sign of the end of the world. However, we as ordinary human beings, untainted, or if you are tainted, get yourself untainted, or you won't go to heaven. You're not going to get anywhere if you're locked to this world's evil system. You need to divorce yourself from it. By the way, that is in the Bible. Be in the world, but not of it. That is a genuine maxim of wisdom which you can apply to your life, and you'd better, or you won't make it anywhere. You'll die here. And this is already hell, so you don't go to hell. You'll simply stay in hell. Probably to become oblivious, but we don't know, and we don't care, because that's the irrational result. If you're irrational, and you can't adjust to reality because you have not sufficient love in your heart to do so, then your fate is already sealed and you know it. So, instead of being a trapped rat, a true scientist is someone who is looking for freedom, emancipation, and acceptance by heaven so that consciousness may continue. The Hadron Collider is a device which is meant to smash two protons together. It can smash other particles together, and this has been tried, but by and large, the thrust of the Hadron Collider research is to understand the proton, because it contains, and we know this now, it contains the next source of power, which you could even call hyperpower, which began with the discovery of fusion energy, which is the fissioning of the atom. Heavy atoms can be forced to fission at high speed. This is a chain reaction which generates an enormous amount of energy, which is amply demonstrated in what it was meant for to begin with, in the dropping of the atomic weapons upon Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which actually interrupted a very important Go game going on in Japan in 1945 in August at that time. And that Go game is now on record as the Atomic Go game. The game was eventually resumed. So that was the discovery of fission energy, enabled by the mighty work of the mighty Einstein. He went to Roosevelt to make sure that he did his part as a human being. Forgive Einstein, he was caught up in a world far beyond his ability to cope with or deal with. But that was the discovery of fission energy, followed shortly thereafter, within only a couple of years, just before I was born, in 1954. By then, the thermonuclear weapon, which is a stupid name, but science is well known for stupid names, has nothing to do with thermo anything. What it is fusion energy, which had been harnessed by then in order to create even larger bombs, one of which very nearly destroyed humanity in 1960 when I was 6 years old. That is the Tsar Bomba. And if you're interested in explosions, which I certainly am, I am still a boy at heart, even though it almost destroyed civilization, the Tsar Bomba is the largest weapon ever detonated on the face of the earth. And it was a very interesting story, which I strongly recommend, especially since now a lot of the Soviet scientist information about that bomb has been declassified. If you want a good ride, something really entertaining, the Tsar Bomba is something else. But that's fusion energy, and of course the greedy and malignant governments of the world cannot possibly be satisfied with that if there is a possibility of an even stronger weapon. So about the same time that the so-called space race began, which was entirely contrived, the space race occurred or began in the 1960s, as many of you are familiar with. The movie called The Right Stuff is a good expose of that time of history, although that was the Mercury program, not the Apollo program. Men's desire to get into outer space coincides with government's desire to get into outer space, and of course it's the governments that get into outer space, but we still get the benefit of the fallout from industrial science. So that's the milieu around the time of the discovery of fusion energy, and so the Hadron Colliders, ever since, have been dedicated to the notion that there is a third and stronger power which would create a bigger bomb. You could say, more antiseptically, a greater source of efficient power. That is being sought with the use of Hadron Colliders, enormously wasteful, and obviously the governments who support Hadron Colliders have no concern or interest with or for humanity. They're only interested in serving their group mind master, which is dedicated to destroying the earth, because group minds are of course irrational and immoral. So that brings us up to today, and what we discovered from the Hadron Colliders, which is the only result that's even worth knowing about because it is a valid scientific discovery. The nature of the proton was still somewhat indiscernible from colliding them together. The collision of two protons produces a massive array of what are called particles because there's no other word for them, but they're pieces of the protonic system. So the proton is a system, it's a tiny machine. Because this is a freestanding machine with no source of power of its own, it was invested with energy at its inception, which would be its creation in whatever mode the universe was created, which is totally unknown to science and will remain unknown, well, except for what I've discovered, which is the answer. So you will know about the creation of the universe from what I'm about to say. We're already at 35 minutes. This will be an extremely long lecture if I get my way. And again, if you can't tolerate that, you know exactly what you can do. So I hope you're with me thus far. I'm just waking up, so I need some breakfast. All my life I've consumed a maximal amount of fluid. I very much enjoy drinking. Whatever you may think of that is unimportant. So the proton has been investigated in both senses in which physics approaches a phenomenon on the order of the proton, which is ultimate. First of all, by physically colliding them together. The standard it really should be called subparticle physics. The standard model of subparticle physics has been mathematically determined with various highfalutin terms such as the Eightfold Path, which is actually taken from Eastern mysticism, which is much more valid than the standard model. But the nature of the proton was worked on. Of course, it is one of the 2 or 3 top goals in industrial science right now to understand the proton in any way, to get at the source of that power, which is there. And what was discovered, besides the pieces that fly out from colliding them together, what was divined, what was discovered, was by a man named Gelman. And Gelman, he's very famous for this, and I believe he got a Nobel Prize for this, but I can't swear to that, but you could look it up if you wish to know about the Nobel Prize, which is not very indicative of true science, but it's a fun human endeavor to give $1 million prizes. It's worth $1 million now. Although I believe the unit for that is kroner. But whatever the case about the prizes given for men who discover things, Gelman discovered something that is remarkably simple, but it's been turned into some kind of strange exotic religion, you'd have to say. So I'm simply going to give you the facts, which are extremely important. And it's a very simple fact that the proton is a 2-1 harmonic. And the way that is described in as close as we can get to physical terms is that there are 3 quarks. These are called quarks, and it is pronounced that way. It's a term taken from Lewis Carroll. Really, this is normal in science to seek afar afield to get words. It's very difficult to find words for things. In computer science, it's one of the 2 biggest problems, is trying to figure out names for your variables. And I can tell you, even though that sounds hilarious, it's actually true. I am a professional programmer. And coming up with variable names is really quite a daunting task. But if you're naming real things that are not variables, but they're actual physical things, you end up with names like Big Bang, black hole, dark matter, dark energy. You get contradictory terms, illogical terms, such as natural selection, which is based on random mutation. And I just want to teach you a little trick so you know something about that. Take natural selection, which is a stupid term, and random mutation, which is a good term, and reverse the association of the two component words, and then you get natural mutation, which is a direct contradiction, and random selection, which is another direct contradiction. So that basically sums up Darwinian natural selection, biological evolution, which has been fully disproved. But that's very interesting, isn't it? In any event, we don't want to get off on a tangent. The proton is composed of 3 quarks. A strange word, but that is the word that has been adopted, and we're forced to accept it, since in science, once a term has been adopted, no matter how nonsensical or anti-scientific, such as Big Bang, black hole, or quark, you're stuck with it. It will never be changed because science has no feedback mechanism. This is one of the tremendous flaws in modern science, that it cannot monitor itself, which means that it will run out of control. Because without a negative positive feedback, it will go asymptotic, a version of the ultraviolet catastrophe. If you only have positive feedback and you're just patting yourself on the back all the time, you will lose the ability to use science correctly. And that is what has happened. So that's another angle on the modern situation. So what are quarks? They're called up and down, and in this tri-state, only one of them can be in the state that's opposite of the other two. In other words, one of the 3 quarks is in one state, and the other 2 will be in the other state. This is simply to say that Gell-Mann discovered a mathematical relationship which I am able to interpret geometrically due to what I know is going on. The proton is considered to have a positive charge. That is an electrodynamic term, positive and negative charge. This concept is basic to electrodynamics, and it works in terms of electrical engineering and forms the basis of electrodynamics as it is taught in all universities today for industrial purposes. But it's not very helpful in understanding the proton. The proton can be said to have a positive charge, but only in relation to the electron. And that is extremely important to understand, so I'll just mention that as we continue with our discussion of the quark system of the proton. This quark system of the proton generates an effect which characterizes the proton and actually defines it. So, to answer the question of what is the 3 quark system, is to address directly what is the proton. The proton is essentially what it does. That is what it is what it does. So what does it do? It bends space. It bends space spherically, and that's redundant in a sense because the proton, in this sense, is the center of its local system. And this is using the word local in the modern use of the word, in which it's also used in quantum mechanics to describe locality as opposed to non-locality, which is one of the formulations of the quantum paradox. So, I hope that's not confusing. My intent is to simplify things. That is the purpose of the communicative phase of science, to promote understanding, which is the primary goal, is to understand something such as the proton. I claim it's the center of the universe, but that's obviously absurd without knowing why I say it. And here's the reason why it sounds absurd is because when you say the center of the universe, we think of that as a non-distributed thing, which in geometry is absolutely true. So this is really walking the plank, is to go as far as to hypothesize, you'd have to say, that the proton is the center of the universe. You could also say it's a center of the universe, since there are quite a few protons in the universe. But pursuant to my thematic approach to this subject, which I know is correct, I don't any longer need to wonder if it is, but you do need to wonder if it is, I'll now attempt to prove to you that the proton is the center of the universe, even though it's distributed wherever protons are. It is quasi-logical or potentially logical to say so. Even superficially, a prima facie case can be made by pointing out that the universe, when it's perceived spherically as we do, even though you can say it has one edge, thinking about that for a moment, it's not really a one. Because if it's illimitable in all directions, you can't really count it. So we're artificially counting it, and the right term for that, a much better conceptualization of what that is geometrically, it's an integral. So the edge of the universe is more correctly said in the mind, the human mind, is to say it this way, and I expect you to do so now, so adjust your mind to cope with this changeover. That the edge of the universe is the integral of the universe. That's not exactly properly true, but we don't really have words for what is infinite. So if you could accept that, I'll give you the other side of that. The proton is what's the opposite of the integral in calculus? Do you know the name for that? It's called the infinitesimal. To the degree that you can speak of a number, for instance, well, it's really counting. It's a counting term. Calculus deals with numerics, of course. So we are talking about a numerical formulation. The edge of the unbounded universe cannot really be conceived as a number, but in calculus language, you can give it a name which is much more appropriate than the edge. It would be the integral. So we'll say that. Then it must have an infinitesimal. That is the fundamental principle of calculus, that the integral and the infinitesimal are dual. That's a very important principle which you can accept. To the degree that we can assign a number to the edge of the universe which is larger than all numbers within the universe, so we must, not that we can, but that we actually must, assign a tiniest number which is not zero, because it has to be an actual number. And that would be a new category of numbers, actual numbers. I can't use the word real because it's already taken to describe the unreal numbers. So that's how badly off mathematics is. And that has to do with the concept of numeric continuity. The real numbers are the effort of man's brain to make the number line continuous, which is a direct contradiction with even machine logic, because if you have a continuous number line, you simply have no numbers. So the number line is not continuous. Numbers must be discrete. And so the real numbers are actually the unreal numbers. So that's a slight detour, just to give you an idea of what we're speaking of when we speak of numbers, that they're inherently contradictory in the formulation of so-called real numbers. But actual numbers are real. This is how we use them to describe physics. So in that sense, if you're going to have a number to describe sphericity, it will have to be a two-component number, because for every integral there's an infinitesimal. In spherical space, there can only be one of each if you're conceiving the universe as a single object, which of course we do. Therefore, it is perfectly reasonable to say that the proton is the infinitesimal to the exact proportion that the entire universe is the integral. And therefore, as we're now going to discuss the quark system, what we're approaching is the infinitesimal of universal space. So the proton is highly regarded, not just in industrial physics in order to get the power out of it, but it's central to the concept of physics itself. And so this is one of the fundaments of physics that I discovered. One of the solutions that science has been seeking is exactly what I am going to tell you now. The proton's three-quark system is a harmonic, and what Gell-Mann actually discovered cannot be directly perceived in his industry because they're not looking for understanding. They just aren't. And Gell-Mann simply could not perceive the value of his own discovery. He was rewarded by the industry, which I believe he deserved. It's perfectly reasonable from their point of view to consider the three-quark system as a major breakthrough in their search for power. But for us, in natural philosophy, natural science, we're seeking actual answers to benefit humans. This is the way to get that understanding. I've discovered it, so I'll share it with you. The three-quark system is a harmonic. It's a 2-1 relationship. That is the transcendental significance of the number 3, which there's actually been a branch of natural philosophy which has pursued the very nature of numbers and their relationships with each other, and that is called, if I can recall the name correctly, it's a form of divine geometry. That is called divine geometry. I did not invent that term. I don't necessarily condone it, but it's good enough. So the value of the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and even going further have been considered philosophically. I believe that's probably the best way to say it. And the number 3, of course, ranks very highly in the ranking of divine numbers. In geometric relationships is how this was pursued, I think, to effect. I learned something from a book called Divine Geometry. But whatever the case, you may not like that. It may sound superstitious. But in probing, in the inductive phase of science, you're allowed to go anywhere to get leads. And philosophy is greatly helpful. When you don't know where else to look, you may get some good ideas from something which sounds like alchemy. By the way, Sir Isaac Newton studied alchemy, and we now know that, of course, is chemistry. So the number 3 is not a number you would expect to find at the center of the universe, but there's a good reason why we have found the number 3 inside of the infinitesimal. I hope you're following that so far. I hope these terms do not daunt you. This is meant to be simplifying, but we are reliant on words and ordinary linguistic constructions to communicate. And we're forced to use words which may already have ambiguous meanings, but you need to focus your mind on what I'm saying in order to gain the benefit of the words I'm using. So I hope that's obvious. It shouldn't be daunting. It's normal. It's what we do in every classroom. So the three-quark system is inherent and basic. This is extremely important, and I want to just mention what I began to say, and now I can conclude a previous thread about the Hadron Collider research, is that once Gell-Mann had discovered the trinary state, the tri-state, really it's better called a harmonic, and you could call it a 3-part harmonic, but that's actually redundant. A harmonic, at the most basic level, as I'll be bringing out, this is not well known, so this may sound abstruse, but the basic harmonic of the universe, it has been discovered in the proton. It's a 2-1 harmonic. And this oscillates between one, you could say one is positive perhaps to the proportion that the other two are negative. That's obviously not strictly true. But when one of these changes, this one cannot change, because they can never all three be in the same state. So when one of these two changes, you can see what happens. It goes basically like this. And so it goes like this. And that's called a harmonic, based on the 2-1 relationship, and that's what Gell-Mann discovered. The significant fact from the point of view of hard physics is that thing that is called a quark cannot be isolated. And this is known now. So this is a fact of science which has been revealed in the process of scientific discovery of enormous value. It's not valuable to the industrial scientists conducting these experiments. And they're very likely unaware of what I've said, or if they are aware of it, they're trying to use it to pry out the power so they can make another whatever from that. So the center of the universe is an infinitesimal, it's a distributed infinitesimal. And I hope I've shown to you that that makes sense geometrically, if you can just adjust your mind to that, that the integral edge is incalculable, and to that proportion, the infinitesimal also cannot be calculated. But this is a major breakthrough, because we can actually see the quark system. That is the nature of Gell-Mann's discovery. So, given this basic discovery of the harmonic that defines the proton, we're now capable of going forward with what is called force mechanics. And force mechanics is now known to a very restricted circle of physicists. It is now known, but it's not accepted, it's not discussed, it's not used. But you and I can use this. It's extremely important to understand what is the harmonic of the infinitesimal, which we call the proton. It is, in this sense and to this effect, the proton is an energy source. It does manifest a mechanism, which is this harmonic. So it is a form of bound energy. And the effect that this has, such that we know about this particle at all, is that it bends space. So now it is correct, and Einstein discovered that. We're getting to space-time, which is a misformulation, but the fact that you can consider space to be curved is physically true, which is saying something, because it says something about space, which is that it can bend. It can bend spherically. And in that sense, one could surmise that perhaps space is the manifestation of the proton. That's saying too much so far, but I would like you to begin thinking in that direction, because this will turn out to be true. So what is bending space is a harmonic. And this is an oscillator, and that's the word we're going to use. The proton is an oscillator whose effect is to bend space, and therefore gravity is a force. As I've proved, and you should accept by now, but if you haven't heard me say this, I'll say it, is that gravity is integral protonic centripetal force. This word centripetal will become central in the final solution to what is physics, because there are only two forces in the universe. The proton manifests one of those two forces as centripetal force, which is defined as a spherically oriented force around a center, which we now know is a harmonic. So that is the pulsing center of the universe, which manifests to us as static space. And that should make sense, that space appears real to us and consistent, just empty space in which matter exists. The reason matter exists in empty space can at least be partially defined upon the fact that there could be no space without the proton, because there would be nothing to bend. So space and the proton are intrinsically related. This is extremely important for when we turn to the electron, which we're going to do next. And so, to summarize what we know about the proton, it is the infinitesimal harmonic which forms a center to space around which space is bent. Now, in an atomic system, we can see how space is bent. Because of the way the electrons organize themselves around the proton. This is a spherical relationship, and only one word needs to be added to that to get the basic visualization of what is a proton and an electron and what is an atom, an atomic system. The generator is at the center, the harmonic. There can be more than one proton at the center up to a certain limit, which begins to rapidly lose cohesion when there are 100 or more protons approximately. It will begin to fission by itself, and this is obviously due to a force exerted between protons. This has a name, but we're not going to get into that now. We're only dealing with the elementary system, which is the reduction of the core to its minimum, which is one proton. And one proton is an isolated unit in the universe. We know that because it's spatially isolatable. So nothing is really inside the proton, and the three quarks simply describe something that cannot be described spatially, and that's extremely important, because it means that the harmonic, which we call a proton, creates a particle, and the definition of the particle, which is essential for you to understand, for any of us to understand, I'm not talking down to you, this is what we're all trying to understand. A particle is exactly what a proton is, for the reasons I just said. But one word should be added because there is a duality involved with the electron. The proton is a spatial center to the universe. It is a spatial center. So the word impenetrability is considered to be the province of what is called scientific philosophy, and this is a valid province of science. In older science, going back about 2.5 centuries, a man named Ruger Joseph Boschkevich was examining the force balance relations in the universe, and he was quite successful in his research, and it's resurfacing again to a restricted circle of physicists and scientists. That Ruger's work is now well known. I have read his book and I understand his force mechanics. And it is well admitted now, again in a very restricted circle of scientists, you would have to probe a bit, but you can find out the research that has been done in unearthing the discoveries made by Ruger about atomic structure. And it's remarkable what he discovered in force mechanics. So now, instead of dealing with just the proton, we're going to talk about the atomic system, which only has one other component, called the electron. The first question that you might ask, I certainly know that I did, I still do, this is an ongoing perception, is that the electron may or may not be a particle. Our words fail here, and so I'm just going to artificially distinguish between two kinds of particles. The way I said it's not artificial at all, so that's correct. Let's go on with that thought. There are two kinds of particles. The proton is a spatial particle. Well, what is the electron then? When you may have already guessed. So I'm just giving you a moment to think about that. If the proton is a spatial particle, as has been proved, you can file that one away forever. That's permanently known. That is a fact of science. The proton is a spatial particle for the reasons I just stated. So I hope you followed this so far. I'm trying to keep this simple. I don't know how this could be broached more simply than I'm broaching it, but this is the most difficult problem that's ever faced physics, so you should expect to hit some bumps in the road. I'll try to smooth out those bumps as best I can. That is my job. So, what kind of particle is the electron if it's not a spatial particle? Or perhaps it is a spatial particle. What can we say? Well, to the degree that it could be considered in space, we know of the electron. It can actually be fired from a gun. So, in that sense, the electron is an object. To call it a particle, I hesitate there because that word is already taken up by the proton. Only the proton is a particle. But if you add one word, you get the space-time dichotomy. So we're going to restate what I stated with one added word, that the proton is a spatial particle. Well, the counterpart to the word spatial is temporal, and I assume you know what that word means. All it is the adjective for time, to the same proportion that spatial is the adjective for space. And the electron is a temporal particle. It's called a fermion in the Standard Model, and that is actually somewhat useful to know what the definition of a fermion is. You could call it a fermion electron, and to call it a fermion is to attribute to the particle, as it's called, characteristics. And that's the reason for the term boson as well. Boson and fermion are antithetical because fermions obey this is attributed to Fermi for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, but it's obviously due to the fact that he did research in this area. He was a very high-level physicist, as I'm sure you're well aware. But the fermion is named after Fermi mechanics, or you should say Fermi statistics. And the boson is named after a man named Bose, B-O-S-E. I think he's less well known, but he's considered of sufficient authority in physics to use his name to name a certain type of particle. So that's the difference between fermion and boson, is statistical mechanics. I'll just call it that. That's to do with the characteristics of what is being seen. The electron, I looked this up in Wikipedia just to make sure. The electron is not known to have a radius. It is very strange. It's almost as if it's the perfect depiction of a wave, a freestanding wave. That is correct. The electron is not a particle at all, except in the very restricted sense that it is an isolated unit. So if you use that definition, which is the most intuitive, you can do so, but you have to realize what you're doing when you do that. The proton is a particle, but I will introduce a term that's already been used, so this is a reuse of an existing term, but it's the right use of the term. and that is antiparticle. The electron is an antiparticle. And this can be rigorously defined, and it's very worthwhile to do so, is try to discover something similar in characteristics or properties between the electron and the proton, and you will not find it. There is no relationship whatsoever between the proton and the electron except in the most simplistic and really misleading sense that they both seem to occupy a place in free space. This is so obvious that the electron and the proton simply won't go together. The electron, in its relationship to a proton, will approach, due to what's considered to be attraction, actually considered to be electrodynamic attraction on a charge relationship. You could say that, and you can construct electrodynamics around it. But actually, all that is happening is that the electron is obeying the force mechanics of the proton. And as you know, the force mechanics of the proton creates bent space around it. What does that mean, that it bends space? Well, we call it gravity. This is the source of gravity, of course, because it's a centripetal force, as is gravity. So the electrodynamic relationship between the proton and the electron, although it can be extended to electrodynamic charge relationship, is actually simply gravity. In other words, it's due to the bending of space. And this is where we get a photograph of Boshkovitchian force mechanics. It is, in fact, the Bohr atom, which is arranged in shells. And shells, that is a most interesting geometric term, because what a shell is a concentric ring. It's a spherical ring around a center. Now, we see that in our solar system, but it's flattened. It's flattened to a disk. But if it were not flattened to a disk, and the planets were rotating freely around the sun, they would be rotating in concentric spherical rings instead of concentric circular rings. And this shows a fundamental relationship between the circle and the sphere, which is both at once intuitively obvious, but geometrically of extraordinary significance, because they're both closed lines. All other lines are open lines. So the circle can be squashed to an ellipse, but basically it's a closed line. This has been studied for centuries, and I think you understand what I just said. It's not really what you would call rocket science. Is that a sphere, when it is collapsed linearly, makes a circle. And this is, in fact, how we encounter the moon when we're children, is that we're seeing a sphere, but it looks like a circle. So that's just a little bit of, I guess you could say, philosophical extrapolation on the significance of this relationship between the electron and the proton. That the proton is a spatial particle, but the electron might be a temporal particle. That is, it exists in temporal space. Now, that might sound like a contradiction because time and space are two different things. Well, I think you're already aware that time and space are no longer considered two separate things, and that is called space-time, which leads to Einstein's solution for the computation of gravitational space, which is a volume space based on protonic centripetal force. So in his formulation for volume space for gravity, he was forced to consider the center of gravity, which of course is the proton, but in a large system, a macro system, such as, for instance, the solar system, to compute the weight of the solar system, or indeed anything to do with the gravitational dynamics of the system, one is required to resort to something that goes beyond Newtonian mechanics. It's interesting that Newtonian mechanics is contained within space-time, and all space-time actually is an extension of Newtonian mechanics to make it more precise. And the reason why it cannot be as precise as is needed for macrospace computations is because in Newton's day, he could only deal with things in his laboratory. That's not exactly correctly said, but he was much more greatly limited in his ability to conduct experiments. And so he was aware of the fact that his computation of gravity was accurate, but it was only accurate to a threshold. And he tried to deal with this in a brief section of his work Principia and elsewhere, where he talked about continuity. And continuity is the reason why he invented the calculus, was to get at continuity. Because continuity is exemplified in curvature. Curvature is continuous by definition. But linear logic, linear mathematics, does not directly address continuity except on a straight line. So in spherical space, this was inadequate. And why? He knew why, but he couldn't solve it. It was Albert Einstein, in his equivalency principle, who solved the problem which he identified correctly. In order to extend Newtonian mechanics to more accurately portray gravity, he was forced to incorporate the time differential. And this led him to formulate space-time, which is a very logical formulation in linear algebra, which works. It works to the threshold of the calculus. It does not solve the irrationality between linear and curvature, linearity and curvature, but it using the calculus, you can literally make it as precise as you want, but it's still going to be finite, which finite, that is finity, implies a quantum. If it's continuous, there is no quantum. That's the difference between quantum mechanics and what you would have to call continuous mechanics. Up until the time of Planck, mechanics, that is, the way forces work in the universe, were considered to be continuous, because obviously they are. And in fact, it can be proved that they have to be. But at the discovery of the quantum by Max Planck, which has since been verified using linear mathematics and experiments to validate our linear mathematics, we now know something about the universe that we did not know before, but it remains a paradox, which is that the quantum, by definition, interrupts continuity. The question is that even possible? And if it is impossible, which was the paradox at the time of Planck, Planck himself did not like his discovery, because the quantum is the interruption of continuity. An energy packet must be self-contained. But in order for it to be self-contained, it has to detach from a continuous system. And that is what has been discovered, is that energy is quantized. We think. I'm going to show you that that's actually an illusion. It's extremely important to understand that, because of the nature of continuity and what is called impenetrability. And these are the two terms that appear on every page of Ruđer Josip Bošković's monumental work on force mechanics. So we're now going to apply Ruđer's solution to the atomic equation. To get at the relationship between the proton and the electron, it must be visually perceivable. That is, it must have a geometric basis. That's what I'm going to show you. But that's an hour and 20 minutes. I need to take a break. It's very early in the morning right here in Chico. This is December 13th, just 12 days before Christmas at 4:45 a.m. It is currently 34 degrees, and since my heater just came on, that's why I took off that coat. So I hope you tune in for the next lecture. This is the continuation of the Boschkovitz sequence, which will run through Christmas, and I will give you, as I promised, the solution to quantum mechanics. So thank you for tuning in. It's a great pleasure to be able to give these lectures. It helps me organize my thoughts. This is all I do. This is all I want. I know that I'm on the right path. May you be on your right path too. And if you have any doubts, start getting out under the night sky, because that's where you're going to find out the real connection that you have with the universe. You are beloved, but you won't know that until you reciprocate. And you have been directed by all the ancient holy writings, and indeed now by science itself. If you want to reciprocate your love that you feel, then you can do so by looking up. You were directed to do so by Yeshua HaMashiach, who pointed to Abraham, who was an astronomer who was blessed by the Most High God under the night sky, where God was directing him to look at the stars, and then he placed his name upon Abraham. And that is called salvation. It's when you become aware of the eternal love that your Creator has for you, by which he wants you to remain conscious in his presence. You can do so, but only if he says so. So he told you how to get his approval. You don't need me for that, but you do need to look up. This is Anagalactic bringing you the secret of quantum mechanics. We'll be right back.